and so that we can share all of this knowledge with your teachers if you'd like to share it, or instructional coaches and things like that. So if you just joined, we'd love for you to add in the chat where you're from and what you teach. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to the presenters. I'll let them introduce themselves and get started. Thanks, guys, for being here.
Excellent. It's so good to see you guys and a couple familiar faces. It's awesome. Very fun. Yes, please do put kind of where you're from, what you teach kind of down there. That just is helpful to know who we're talking to as we're here. So just thanks to Amy so much for inviting me. That's just such a kind introduction. So just briefly, so I'm Kristen Orton. I work right now for Heartland AEA. I'm currently a regional director, so do a lot of work in special education, kind of administrative support for a lot of our staff. I did my my graduate degree in special education and my PhD in school psychology, both from University of Oregon, so go Ducks. I spent a lot of time studying kind of effective instruction in both literacy, kids with special education. I've spent the last kind of 16 plus years really working with our schools to figure out how do we apply all of that great research and evidence-based practice in real schools with real kids, because that gets complicated. So just in different ways with individual kids, groups of kids, systems of kids. So that's kind of the perspective that I am coming from today. And I will turn it over to Wendy, who's going to kick us off too.
You bet. And I also think it is important to know, Kristen was on the Dyslexia Task Force, which I think also as a member of that has a very unique perspective to bring to this.
And I would add, so is Lana. I see Lana on here.
Lana's on there too. I know, it's so exciting. The amount of expertise on this webinar right now in this room is so powerful. And I think, so yeah, my name is Wendy Robinson. And actually, so this is my 39th year in education. And I started out as a speech and language pathologist in Heartland. And I'll be honest, I worked in a district where we kind of figured out a lot of our students really didn't have very good language skills. They didn't have very good literacy skills. And that is probably where my love of literacy came from. I did a lot of team teaching in the Head Start and the special education rooms, then in the kindergarten classrooms, and did a lot of team teaching in the first grade. And that kind of then moved me much more into the literacy world. And I supported our school-wide academics around the early phases of RTI, around looking at screening and starting to observe kids who weren't making the gains that we might have anticipated. So I'm like with Kristen, I've spent then all these last years really helping troubleshoot. It's always been able, no matter how many times I've changed jobs in Heartland, I'm currently the Director of Instructional Services. One of my roles is to continue to problem solve and troubleshoot our students with those persistent reading difficulties, including students with dyslexia. So I'm just excited to be part of this group, to continue that journey for all of us, to increase our expertise in this area, and to make a difference for kids. So what we'd like to do tonight is we wanted to build on some of the themes and topics that Amy has shared so far. And we wanted to kind of make some connections back to things that are going on in the state, and then have us take a lens and look at it maybe from that perspective of students with the characteristics of dyslexia, and what does that have to say? One of the things I know all of you already know, there's no single truth when it comes to this, that it's very exciting times in this area, that lots of different disciplines are adding to the research and all those kind of things. So we'd really like to think about, continue to unpack what is it. One, by starting to unpacking the definition. And one reason that's really critical is one of the things that occurred based on the task force and went into legislation is that we did change the definition in Iowa and code to match the international dyslexia definition. Then we're going to look at that dyslexia is one type of reading disability. Going to think about dyslexia within an MTSS framework, and then having a conversation about the so what, having conversations about dyslexias with families and colleagues. And then we want to have time for discussion and questions. So this is the definition. Not asking anyone to memorize it. What I would like us to do now is I'm going to kind of break it into 5 parts. And there are out there, Massachusetts and Indiana have put out some really nice handbooks. And created websites to support this. And one of them is sort of how they sort of chunk this definition out. And then one of the things we're going to do after we go through maybe the 5 parts of this definition and demystify it a little bit and maybe put some teacher friendly definitions around it is then do a poll to see if there's a part of it that you are interested in learning more about or getting a deeper understanding of. So part 1, if you think about it, there's a big idea in this particular part of the definition that dyslexia is a specific learning disability and that it's neurobiological in origin. And we've been studying dyslexia for over 100 years, but it hasn't been until that we could do some of the functional MRI imaging research and things like that we've actually been able to actually study brains. And I know any of you that have done that overview of dyslexia module that the internet or the Iowa Reading Research put out, that they talked about some of the things that they're doing with the functional imaging research. But what it did for us was validate and prove that one of the things that is that dyslexia exists, let's just face it that way, that we had scientific evidence that dyslexia is caused by a difference in how the brain processes particularly phonological information. One of the things we also learned is that our brain really wasn't designed to learn to read. It is a taught skill. And that when all of us learn to read, that the brain sort of rearranges ourselves. And so one of the things we also know with the proper intervention and the proper instructional techniques that we can accelerate the growth of the reading and writing and spelling of students with dyslexia. So probably the biggest idea about this part of the definition is then that struggling readers, including those kids with dyslexia, they right now activate different pathways in area of their brain than proficient readers do. So that causes them to use other less efficient areas of their brains to read words. And that's the part then that we want to target our instruction to activate those more efficient pathways and change those things. Part 2, as educators, this is one that has always been much more apparent in our classroom or in our during our classroom instruction, during our interventions, during our tutoring sessions or anything like that, is that it's characterized by difficulties with both accurate and fluent or effortless word recognition and poor spelling and decoding abilities. And so what that looks like in the classroom is that they struggle with this. They struggle with sounding out words. Sometimes they struggle with even matching those sounds of those letters to the print, reading words both accurately and then over time with that automaticity, and then also their ability to spell words. So that these basic literacy skills that are typically developed in lots of our students in kindergarten through 2nd grade, but these skills can remain a huge challenge for our kids with dyslexia as they progress through school. So once again, this particular characteristic is so much more easier for us to observe. And that's one of the things we really want to start to think about, because one of the things we're really going to talk about is that idea of a real sense of urgency when we notice this very early in our students, as early as kindergarten. We want to start erring on that side of, instead of wait and see or watch and see, but teach and see. So when we think about it, the next part of the definition really hones in on where that core difficulty comes, and it's really distinguished from other learning disabilities, and it's really due to a weakness at that phonological level. So kids who have a weakness at this level have difficulty in tasks that we typically see when we teach in those early grades. They have more difficulty with that auditory blending. They have difficulty with segmenting. And over time, they have that difficulty with manipulating, either adding sounds, deleting sounds, or substituting sounds. And because they have this difficulty, then that has a direct impact on their ability to acquire and then apply those to the written language. And if you think about it, is as simple as this, that if early on, if they're having difficulty really knowing where one sound ends and another sound begins, or distinguishing between individual phonemes, then think about that next application of mapping that on to the letter or letter combinations that they see, that sound to print. And so that is one of the fundamental things that sets dyslexia apart as this type of reading disability. Part 4. So a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times it surprises us. Sometimes it could be a student that has this amazing oral vocabulary, these amazing listening comprehension skills, having no difficulty in any other areas, but every single time we start to bring print into any type of our activities or our academics, then all of a sudden they have tremendous struggle, and it's persistent. And it's also typically in spite of instruction that has been effective for many other students in terms of looking at that. So it's that persistence, and it's kind of a surprise that it's when print is involved, and all of a sudden where there's this huge difficulty in acquiring those skills in an accurate and effortless way. And we want to hang on to that because it allows us to start thinking about, once again, with a sense of urgency and a plan. When we start to see this, then what can we do instructionally to, from the research, look at what is more effective and to do it earlier so that we don't have that persistent nature of it continue. And then the last part, and that's once again why we really want this real sense of urgency. We want to do earlier rather than later with any of our students who are starting to show us difficulties in that area, is because if you, as the kids progress through that difficulty with decoding both accurately and fluently, definitely impairs their ability to understand text. If we don't read the words the author wrote, if we don't read with a minimum rate to support our phonological memory cannot simultaneously make meaning from the text as well as decode the different words. And then over time, they're going to read less. They're going to have less opportunity to develop vocabulary and their background knowledge. And then so that over time, it also starts to affect their comprehension and their vocabulary. If we know that in kindergarten, the typical student picks up 3 to 4 brand new words a day, primarily through read alouds and academic type of conversations. But if we look in 3rd grade, the average student picks up 6 to 8 brand new vocabulary words a day. And if we think about traditionally what occurs between kindergarten and 3rd grade, and that's that our kids become independent readers and read widely. So once again, we can start to see where the secondary consequence can become just as problematic as the initial difficulty with that decoding, beginning accurate and fluent in terms of that. So before we move on to the next thing, I'm just going to kind of launch a poll, and we're going to want to keep those 5 parts in mind as we continue to go through. So I'm going to launch the poll, and basically the poll is that the part of the definition that I want to gain deeper understanding is. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and show the results. All right.
Are you guys all able to see that? Okay. Just never know if I'm the one sharing screen, if that's coming through.
All right, Kristen, thanks.
Perfect.
I just was gathering that for my own feedback. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that I was looking at that as well. Thank you. I hope we'll keep having that. All right. And Wendy, I realized that we didn't put our link to our slides for people in the chat. So can you do that, since I am sharing? I can't get to the to that link. All right. So in looking at this, one of the things I did want to kind of just spend a couple minutes kind of backing up with people. One of my experiences in working with groups of teachers and people who are newer to dyslexia or are learning about it, and trying to attach it to what you already know about working with struggling kids or working with students with reading difficulties, which I would guarantee almost all of you have had that experience. And what I wanted to do was try to take not only that definition, kind of taking that apart, but now also connect it to things that you already know. Because one of the common things I sometimes hear is when we start to talk about dyslexia, sometimes people's initial reaction is, oh my gosh, I don't know anything about that. But you really do know a lot of things about working with students who have difficulty learning or have difficulty learning to read. And so I just wanted to connect that to that. So one of the things that I have found helpful in reminding people when we talk about what dyslexia is, and this is that part of that definition too that Wendy shared, is that dyslexia is a specific learning disability. And I think it's important for us to remember that specific learning disability is a category of disabilities in that area of learning, of which dyslexia is one of the types of that. And I think that helps it just kind of anchor into a broader understanding. So this particular breakdown is one that I find really helpful from Jack Fletcher in one of his new books on learning disabilities, and really kind of outlines there are, under this broad umbrella of specific learning disability, there are multiple types of reading disabilities. The one that I have the arrow on is one type of learning disability in that area of word recognition and spelling, which is where dyslexia would fall. But there are also other reading disabilities. There are reading disabilities in the area of comprehension that are a little later developing. There are some mixed learning disabilities in the area of reading. So not every student with a reading disability has dyslexia, although we also know that dyslexia is the most common of the types of learning disabilities. It's also our best researched, and it is the one that we've got a lot of data on, more than some of our other disabilities. So as you're thinking about kind of what you know and linking it to other pieces that you know, I think that is important to remember. The other piece I would just add in that, especially when we're talking about schools, is just a reminder that specific learning disability is one of those categories within IDEA special education law that we serve in special education, and it is the most common type of disability that we serve. So many of our students, whether they are formally identified or not with a disability, a lot of them have these characteristics of that specific learning disability. So just again, to attach it to some of those things that you know. One of the other things that I pulled up for you, because I find this really helpful to kind of anchor to, what do we know about students who struggle learning to read? And many of you, if you've looked at kind of the science of reading and think about what we know about how reading develops and that simple view of reading that really talks about reading being two main components. We know that good readers have to have really good word recognition skills or word identification skills, decoding skills, kind of those foundational pieces that they need to be able to take the code, look at the code, and actually translate that, all those symbols into words that they know. We also know the other big foundational piece is that good readers need to have good language comprehension. They need to be able to understand how those words create ideas and create meaning from that. So if we think about all the students, whether they have disabilities or not, we often look at a lot of students with this understanding of those two big pieces of kind of the reading rope, is around, where are they at with those decoding foundational skills, and where are they at with those comprehension skills? And I find this classification really helpful in also letting us start to think about, what are my instructional strategies? We know that all kids need to have instruction in all parts of those reading skills, but some students, depending on their difficulties and what we know about what we're seeing, might need to have more instruction, more specific instruction in one or more of those areas. And so this can kind of help us think about the readers that we see in our classrooms and help think about how to target those a little bit more in detail. So if you think about on that left-hand side then of this graphic, good word recognition or poor word recognition, and then across the top, either good comprehension and poor comprehension. And as all of you know, that is an oversimplification because kids can fall anywhere on this continuum. So take that obviously with a grain of salt. But what we want for all kids to be on track is that they can both look at the words, decode them, come up with with what those words are, they have good word recognition, and they have really good language comprehension skills that after they actually figure out what those words are, then they're able to make meaning out of them, think deeply about them, make connections with other things that they know. And that's the power that we all know of what reading can do for kids. But then kids can struggle in one or more of those areas. So sometimes we have kids that have really good word recognition skills. It comes effortless to them, it's automatic, but they might have difficulty in comprehension and language comprehension. And so we might see students that have a specific reading comprehension difficulty. We sometimes see students with other disabilities that this is difficult for. They have a language comprehension issue. Often I use the example of some of our students with autism can really learn the code really well, but maybe struggle with understanding pieces of language. So their instructional needs would fall in kind of that upper, on this one, the upper right-hand category. Lower left kind of quadrant, if you will, our kids, like this should sound very familiar with that dyslexia definition. They really struggle with those word recognition skills, becoming effortless and automatic at recognizing words on the page, might even look at some spelling difficulties, difficulty in phonological awareness, but they might have really good language comprehension skills. Once, if you orally tell them a story, they can take off. They can give you some really great insights of what that looks like. And so this would be the category when we think about dyslexia as a disability, that is kind of the place that it would fall. Now, not every student that has this profile of poor word recognition, good language comprehension necessarily has dyslexia, but our students that have pretty like that pure form of dyslexia would definitely fall in that particular category. The other one that some of our students often fall into then is that last one where word recognition is difficult and comprehension is difficult. And so we really, I know you guys can probably all think of students that fall into that category that both of those pieces are hard for them. Some of our students that have some types of dyslexia might be in there. Some of our kids as students with dyslexia who are later readers that maybe didn't get great intervention at the first, or they had a really, just a case that it took them a long while, can sometimes also develop those comprehension difficulties, those secondary characteristics Wendy talked about. So the purpose of kind of bringing this for you is to help start think about what do you observe in students in your classroom? Where might you think about where their skills are based on what you're seeing? And then help you to start thinking about how might I match that to what I know, as well as to think about maybe give you a frame for students with dyslexia where they would fall within those categories of other readers that you might see in your classroom. The only other thing I would just mention is that we also know that within any one of these categories, there's tremendous variability within students. So like this is kind of that, a gross classification, but individual kids definitely have a lot of variation. So even kids with difficulties just in that word recognition phase, kids with dyslexia, the way that shows up in their specific learning behaviors and the specific things they are looking, specific things they struggle with in their reading and writing are going to look different student to student, and it might change in a student over time. So it's important that we kind of keep your great observation skills and instruction as kids continue to learn. So the other kind of brief thing, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but one of the areas that I get a lot of questions about, and I think causes a lot of confusion sometimes with teachers and with teams that I'm working with, is around this area of assessment and diagnosis. And so I was joking with these guys the other day that, if you want to see a really great argument, get a group of like school psychologists, clinical psychologists, and other researchers in dyslexia, and bring up the topic of how should you diagnose learning disabilities or dyslexia. And like it's crazy because we can have some very heated discussions, all well grounded in research about how to do this. And so my point here is to kind of give you kind of this really broad oversimplification of the process, but I wanted to point out kind of just a few things that I think cause confusion sometimes in school teams. So the first one is just that there are, we're going to show two different slides here. There are two different ways that we go at kind of looking at students that might have dyslexia and how we look at meeting their needs. Both of them we call an individualized assessment, but they're slightly different and have different purposes. So one way that kids come up with the diagnosis of dyslexia is by going through an outside clinic an educational psychologist, a number of other educational practitioners that does kind of more of a clinical diagnosis. So they look at an individual student who comes into their clinic. They do a variety of assessment tasks with them to really look at what are the patterns of skills that I'm seeing in this area with all those different literacy skills. And then they match what they're seeing to some set of diagnostic criteria, which might be out of like the DSM-5. It might, they might supplement with some recommendations from somewhere like the International Dyslexia Association, but they're asking the question about, is what I'm seeing in this student, does it match this profile of dyslexia? And then from that, they generate a report that is often shared with families and often with schools about what types of things would be recommended for a student that has this type of pattern. So really, they're asking that question about, does this student have dyslexia? Do they meet this criteria? And then from that, what types of recommendations might be helpful? Very good, very valid. There's lots of places that do a great, that do that really well. In a school setting, we do it slightly different because we're asking a little bit of a different question. And some of you might be familiar with this, but or had experience with that. In a school system, we often are asking a question about whether this individual student requires, are they a student with a disability? In this case, in our example, we're talking about a learning disability or dyslexia that requires special education. And we answer that question in a slightly different way, which is also valid. And it is guided more in the educational world by federal law under IDEA, state law that helps interpret some of that law, as well as some of our practices. So it is a different set of criteria that we're looking at and some different questions that we're asking to answer this question. So we often rely on a couple different kind of three-pronged approach that we're looking at. One is kind of on the left. One of the questions we ask is, what is the student's progress in response to instruction? So you guys know from experience that there are lots of reasons that kids could struggle learning to read. There are lots of reasons that students could have some of those characteristics of dyslexia. And one of the primary ways that we really think about how to decide if this is a really if this is a disability for a student is really looking at if we give them really great instruction that we know is research-based and it is matched to, most kids that get this instruction will respond great and make great progress. A student that doesn't always make progress is more of a red flag about this might be a student with a learning disability. But that's not enough. We also do need to look at that individual student and look at their skill differences. So in that area of literacy, do they have skill gaps in some of those foundational skills compared to standards that would let us see that there's a discrepancy? This kid looks unique from other kids in this grade level. There's something about the pattern of this student's skills that would make me think that is different, along with the fact that they're not making progress with really good instruction that we think should work. So those two things together help us know this is maybe a kid with a disability, but then we also need to ask this question about instructional needs, which is saying, so given what we know about the student, what do they really need for instruction? And kids have to have this need for specially designed instruction, which is adapting kind of the content, the methodology, the delivery of instruction. Sometimes we have students that have a disability, they have dyslexia, but they don't need specially designed instruction that's different than other places that they're getting. So they're not all students that have dyslexia necessarily require special education. Many do, but not all of them. And so I put these two things kind of side by side because sometimes I think this process of, well, I have an outside diagnosis, can't you just use that? Are you just discounting what the family has done, which is not the case, but we have two different standards to compare and they're both valid, they're both reliable, they're both evidence-based, based on research. They're just different ways to approach kind of a similar thing. The other thing I would note as we're working with kids, and we sometimes have conversations with families if they're bringing us reports from outside places, is that both approaches look at the same student in a slightly different way, and they're both valid pictures of the kid. So they are both really good evidence and really should complement each other, and we can use them in combination to figure out what we're all most excited about, which is how are we going to teach the student? How do we get the student to really be a proficient reader so that they are really skilled and really love reading and can use it to access all of the things we want them to access? So
Kristen, there was one question that probably makes sense here. And it says, can the AEA diagnose dyslexia as part of the evaluation?
That is a great question. So the AEA does not diagnose any disability. So in this, a couple things I would say about that. Number one is dyslexia is not one of the categories, even within special education law federally, that gets diagnosed under IDEA. So it is this category of specific learning disability. And in Iowa, we often, we don't necessarily, we're not required to create a diagnosis with that. And there are probably a number of controversies and different opinions on whether that is a good thing or a bad thing. There are some benefits in that we're looking really individually at a student in order to decide what is most important for them. So I always tell families that you won't walk away from a special ed evaluation with a diagnosis, but we are going to look at all of those same skills that you would need to look at in a private evaluation. And we're going to determine how to teach those skills to your student and what they need in order to be successful. What would you add to that, Wendy? Anything else?
I think what it is that it's sort of why we're here tonight, right? And why we're all meeting. We want to think about what data do we have on kids, and how do we start to look at those students who have those characteristics of dyslexia, and we start to change instruction to match that. And that under the law, under special ed law, and under the way the identification system in Iowa should work, is that we don't have to wait for that diagnosis to begin that type of instruction. And so it's that type of thing. And it's such a balancing act, because if we say you don't have to have the diagnosis, we can provide the instruction, but if we aren't recognizing the patterns and we aren't looking at that instructional profile and then providing that type of structured literacy instruction that we know is critical for those students, then it looks like that part of our evaluation system isn't getting at it. But we also, there is this myth out there, there are downsides to labels too. And so that the hardest part a little bit is that it is kind of a double-edged sword in terms of looking at that. So one of the whole premises, and really what we're trying to emphasize tonight, is that from the minute that we're starting to screen our kids, and we screen in Iowa starting in kindergarten, and we look at it starting to assess those high probability reasons to look at our kids who are at risk for dyslexia. If on top of that, you know, the family has shared that there's a history, that we need to watch those kids closer. And it's more about changing our educational system to respond and provide that level of instruction, and in terms of looking at that. Because there, you know, but I still believe that there's this sense that if we did it, then automatically the kids would get the level of instruction that they need to make gains. And so I think that's still where that the difference of understanding those two systems comes from.
I absolutely agree. Yeah, and I think then the big idea is that regardless of how you get to either an identification or diagnosis, that our response or the treatment, if you will, for dyslexia is always instruction. It is really good instruction based on the science of reading, explicit and systematic. We're matching to the student needs. So regardless of kind of how we get to that point, we always get to instruction. And I would say, even with all the debates about how to identify and what data to use and what criteria to use, everyone agrees on what that instruction is the biggest point. Regardless of how you get there, the biggest idea is what we are doing in the classrooms for students, and using a lot of that structured literacy. And then I did want to note just a couple links I put, since you now have access to the PowerPoint. There was a link in the notes to kind of a link to understood.org that has a nice chart that compares a clinical diagnosis and school diagnosis. That's sometimes a tool that we share with families. And then the link here for dyslexia in the classroom comes from IDEA and has some really great descriptions of characteristics of dyslexia, what you see, accommodations, instruction, which is just a great tool, I think, for teachers to have as well.
So it still comes back to the question that was asked earlier: how do we kickstart this? How do we get that level of instruction, those resources to kids earlier? And provide the type of instruction that actually we know is effective for kids with dyslexia or characteristics of dyslexia. So we want to think about what we already have present in Iowa as a way that maybe we can start to continue to build leverage and the supports that we need to get more students with that type of instruction. So when we think about it, universal screening. And so one of the things we wanted to do was anchor these documents in back to very reputable sites. And so there is a nice fact sheet on the International Dyslexia Association just talking about that universal screening. So we know in the state of Iowa that since July, the 2014, 2015, all of our students have to be screened in K3. And then those kids are persistently at risk. So one of the things that we want to understand as educators that can help us to start moving toward providing more of these type of supports to kids earlier is, what are those basic principles of universal screening? Findings from the cognitive science that are the basis of reading and literacy developmental, and then what are those potential risk factors that indicate common reading problems, including dyslexia. So it's that idea of that early warning system and being very responsive. So one of the things that I think about is when we look at the fall of kindergarten and we have letter naming fluency on there, which is a rapid automatic naming assessment. There is a phonological onset recognition, listening for beginning sounds. And you think about those categories. And a lot of our teachers ask, why are these things timed? Why do we care about speed? Well, we don't, but we do care about automaticity. Let's go back to our definition, right? That what is characterized is that, first off, very early on, that sound to print, that phonological component, it looks for those kids, that we have these measures. We use a timer, but that's just about because we're looking for that idea of automatic human behavior, that these foundational skills are automatic. And a lot of times what we see with these kids that can take us by surprise, and the screening can find these kids, is that some of the kids may be really accurate, but they're not automatic. Some of these kids are both inaccurate, which if you're inaccurate, you're not going to be automatic. And we need, then we immediately want to start thinking about some of the instructional principles we're going to talk about next, because that's that first red flag. And the worst thing that's going to happen if we err on the side of teaching using explicit instruction in these areas is that the kid's going to get it. But the best thing that could happen is a kid that potentially who was going to struggle, instead of waiting to see if what typical instruction is for the other kids makes a difference and find out it doesn't, and that persistence is there, is see if we can't turn that around to be successful from the beginning. So we really want to start thinking about how do we change those practices in universal instruction in response to the screening. So once again, really understanding why we screen. We want to identify those kids who are potentially at risk for reading failure. That is what they were really designed to do. And of course, you need to validate once we see that screening, but we also want that sense of urgency. Like I said, err on the side of teaching whenever we see that. We know that dyslexia is a neurobiological disorder. Research has shown us that the brain plasticity decreases through childhood. And the research shows, so think about this just from the fact for a student, it takes 4 times as long an intensity of resources to intervene in 4th grade as it does in kindergarten. So once again, part of our answer to all of this is thinking about looking at those kids at risk right away and thinking about, what do we need to do? What do we need to teach? So let's think about universal instruction. So once again, if we're really thinking about, as educators, knowing what's effective reading instruction for students with dyslexia or characteristics of dyslexia, there's a link to that document from the International Dyslexia Association. But let's even take a look at our Iowa ELA standards and our foundational skills. All of these things of what to teach are part of those foundational skills. So, we need to teach it. What we have to think about is providing and understanding that how to teach. So then you think about under structured literacy, what is the characteristics? What does it mean by explicit instruction? That idea things should be systematic and cumulative. It needs to be hands-on, engaging, and multimodal. And at each level, universal instruction, our tier 2, our tier 3, or even part of our specially designed instruction, we need to be very diagnostic and responsive to the student in terms of looking at all of those kind of things. So probably like the biggest example, practical example I would have, it's not unusual to walk in lots of kindergarten classes where they're doing and they're putting words on their body, right? Very hands-on, very engaging, and very, and we would consider multimodal. We're saying the sounds as we're moving our hands. What I tend to watch for, though, are the kids that are going through the motions, but they really are having difficulty connecting it back to taking spoken words apart. And it could be that they actually can't hear the individual, or one sound ends and another begins. They may not even be able to count sounds and words. And instead of keep doing that whole group routine and hoping the kids catch on, in addition to the whole group routine, and you look at your screening data, I would get those small group of kids, put them in a group, do something like with Alconin boxes that makes it more concrete, more discrete, or look at the learning progressions to go back and teach. It's that type of urgency in our responses that we want to do, because that's what we know will make a difference. And we can start to see where they're breaking down and provide that kind of structure and support. So once again, when we think about our interventions with tier 2 and tier 3, one of the things that's critical is that intervention should be in addition to the universal instruction. They should be evidence-based. They should, if we think when we're picking those interventions and we know this student has that characteristic of dyslexia, that intervention needs to be evidence-based and shown that it made a difference for students that have those type of characteristics. Once again, every student with dyslexia is a little bit different and individual, and in their impact on their reading, their writing, and their spelling. So you want to make sure that you've got a really good match. So you may need additional diagnostic information. And then anything that was in those instructional materials that's checking for mastery checks, we want to be using that as part of the assessment. We also want progress monitoring, because what's critical is that when we're doing this, we should expect those next learning behaviors to show up. And if they don't, we need to make those changes. That's what's super important when we're looking at our students and their response to intervention. And then once again, when we look in our systems, right, that the biggest thing that we find in terms of implementation is sometimes we don't have decision-making rules, and we haven't really looked at the research in terms of what makes a difference in terms of intensity. So we think about our organizational factors, which are time, grouping, duration, and who's doing the teaching and their knowledge. How much do they know about what teachers of reading and spelling need to know to be able to demystify the English language for our students. Then we think about opportunities to respond, that success rate, our focus, review, correction, and scaffolding are all things that we can intensify. So the instructional design of the materials should be mapped that way, as well as our instruction, and very much watching the type of things we would expect students with that type of instructional profile to have difficulty with, to make sure that we're changing our instruction to make a match.
Fantastic. Thank you. So given our time, and we definitely want to have some time for questions and conversations, so I'm going to kind of give you some big ideas. Just this last piece that I found helpful with some different groups is even thinking about some conversations, kind of the now what. So what if, what happens if you have a parent that brings in, like, I know my child has dyslexia, or do you think my child has dyslexia? Or you start to suspect that you might have a student with dyslexia. What do you do with that? And kind of what are your next steps? And so one thing is just to continue learning and continue to kind of gather for yourself really good evidence-based resources. And we've tried to share a few things with you that are just some really good high quality resources that are great for parents, great for yourself. I think as long as I've been in this field, and I'm sure Wendy has been here longer, like there's always more to learn. There are always great new resources coming out, but just continue. The more you know, I think the more you feel comfortable just understanding and having conversations, as well as knowing what to do in the classroom for students as well. But just a couple big ideas that I'm going to toss out, and you can read more in some of the notes as you look at, but just some of the things we've heard that can really cause frustration with families. And we just need to change our language sometimes. So one of the big things that is frustrating to families is that sometimes we will say, well, dyslexia, if they ask, do you think my child has dyslexia? We'll say something like, well, dyslexia is a medical diagnosis, go to your doctor. It's not a medical diagnosis. It can be diagnosed in a clinical setting, but there's a lot of things that we can do in classrooms. And we are the people who are teaching their student how to read and write. And it is something we should be paying attention to and knowing about as well. We also want to make sure we don't say something when they bring up the word dyslexia, that we just say, our quick response isn't something like, well, I don't know anything about that, or I don't know anything about that. I haven't been trained in that. We know a little bit, even if you're not an expert, even if you don't feel really confident, you know a lot about kids that learn how to read, you know about kids that struggle learning how to read. And so that isn't the first response. It doesn't put a lot of confidence in the things that you do know a lot about. And then the last thing is sometimes I hear is that a parent will raise a concern with a specific skill or a specific, a characteristic maybe that they're seeing. And I think sometimes in an effort to try to reassure their parents, we sometimes say, well, that isn't a problem. Not being able to segment, that's not a problem. Or spelling isn't a problem. I don't care about that. Rather than really trying to engage in what the parents are concerned about. So that would just be another, like, if that happens to be something, I think we have all probably used this language at some point with some family, just something to replace it with. And so my recommendation is just because sometimes I think we just need to continue to engage parents and our caregivers and other people to understand what are we concerned about here. So just some good tips. So anytime I think a parent raises a concern, always taking that time, let's listen really carefully to what they're concerned about and asking that question, like, tell me more. Tell me more about what you're concerned about. Tell me more about what you're seeing in your child's reading and writing. And then go ahead and share what are the things that you observe in the child's reading and writing. What are the things you see in instruction? That's where kind of knowing a lot of those factors, paying attention to some of those characteristics. What do you see when you're teaching the student? And what do you notice? And see, based on all that information, what concerns you may or may not have. And then being able to talk about current instruction and how that addresses those concerns. So you are, there's not a school in Iowa that isn't teaching literacy in some way. A lot of you are doing some really great things with interventions. And so using some of that language about we are trying to pull that group of kindergartners to do some extra teaching when they're not getting it in the large group. We're pulling them into an intervention that's focusing on those decoding and word reading skills because we've noticed that too. Anything that can help you talk about what you've seen in the students and what you are trying to do in terms of responsiveness. So just helps keep that conversation going. And I think can help eliminate sometimes some of the challenges we've had in different places that can just get us in trouble as we know things. So. And I think that's the end of kind of our formal slides. So I would love to turn it over. And Amy, I don't know if there's anything that has come up in the chat or other questions people have. I'd love to know kind of thoughts, reactions, and other questions that the group might have and want to dive in more.
I did notice a question, and maybe Abby, you want to join, pop in and ask it more specifically personally, but it was about maybe the role that the SLP might have in helping us determine some diagnosis type things with kids. Do you want to ask that, Abby?
What I've noticed a lot is that a lot of places where SLPs are involved in the process, it's because they're usually a part of that evaluation process and they do a lot of diagnosis within the evaluation, which I understand that that's not where we are, but I'm wondering how we can get them involved in those intervention pieces, especially with the phonological part, even if they're not a part of that evaluation. Because I have a student this year that I've kind of she's definitely dyslexic, and her phonoprocessing, I notice things in like her pronoun usage and her MLU, and she deletes a lot of initial sound or syllables in words, like 2-syllable words. So there's things that are going on. So I was able to kind of get into having an intervention with our SLP, but typically I probably wouldn't be able to with that. So I'm wondering how we can bridge that and get our SLPs more involved, because her work and what she's helping me with is so beneficial to me and the student. So I would like to see that more.
And as an SLP, I'll be honest with you that I think that our SLPs have tremendous background. They understand, when you look at spelling errors, they know, the impact of where the sounds are made and the articulatory gestures and things like that. So I would encourage folks that, we really encourage our SLPs, at least in Heartland, to be, to help teachers, like even on the FAST assessment, because you can't count articulation errors, right? And to support those kind of things. And you're right, whether they directly serve the students, but they're great for consultation and modeling and things like that. And they have vast knowledge in linguistics in that area of phonological. And even those students who might have that are unintelligible, that are, deleting those final sounds. And many of the techniques we actually use in phonological processes therapy are about, believe it or not, auditory blending and marking, and working very closely with our classroom teachers and our interventionists and our special ed teachers. A lot of times too, the print can be a really great way to have them mark those final sounds, and they can make rapid growth in both areas. So I would reach out and start building those collaborative relationships with SLPs, because they will be very excited. Then sometimes too, when we have those kids that have tremendous word retrieval issues that may be showing up, and as instructors in the area of reading, we have to decide, is it a decoding error, or is it a word retrieval error? And we also know, as speech pathologists with word retrieval, that sometimes it depends on if there's different categories of errors, and then your different cueing systems, and they're very knowledgeable in those areas too. So I agree, let's continue to collaborate as groups and bring those different disciplines together to make a difference for kids, because kids aren't divided up in different parts, are they?
Right. And I probably should have maybe said this. Is there maybe my question even more so, as we move towards some of the new legislation that's happening with dyslexia, do we have any plans maybe to make SLPs a more systemic part of that, or no? Is it still going to probably remain more school by school, network by network, luck at the draw? I hate to use that term, but kind of it is, like, how was that where we are with this?
If we think about it, taking a step back, and it isn't part of this group, what we're thinking about is, how do we take the professional learning that's out there? Like, one thing in the pandemic, like, there were so many experts in the area of the science of reading and dyslexia, right, that offered, we could have free webinars and amazing opportunities. So our point is, how do we take the people we know in this state who can make a difference for kids, and how do we leverage their learning and that collaboration, so it isn't just luck of the draw, right, or an island of excellence? And how do we think about working together? And I think, as Chris and I, as leaders at Heartland, we can influence that to ensure that we're promoting that we want our SLPs to be involved with students and to have the background knowledge to think about when speech language impairments also cross over in with reading disabilities. And all of us, in our schools, how do we make sure that there is more professional learning around strategies that are targeted for kids with characteristics of dyslexia? And that's part of what this movement is for, right? Because I'm with you. I agree that we need to do those things.
It's hard when we know their plates are full too. And, like you said, Abby, it might just depend on the person. Are they approachable to ask some questions to help process, to even more of an evaluation type thing? Or will it be like, fill out the form and tell me what's wrong so that we can get something going? So yeah, maybe just as we can kind of open doors for, because man, they have a ton of knowledge, and I'm always asking them, how do I do this sound with my mouth and teach my kids? And she's so available for me to do that in just little things. But
and the only other thing I'd add too is, I know sometimes the SLPs that I get to work with and supervise sometimes say, gosh, I just wish somebody would ask me. Sometimes I hear later on that teachers are struggling with teaching phonological awareness or something, and they're like, oh, I just wish someone would have reached out and asked me. Like, I know something about that. Like, I can help you. I don't maybe necessarily need to be involved in working directly with the student or even doing that, but like, I would be a great person to like answer questions about that. And so it does. And we do always have work to do on making sure all of our SLPs have that knowledge, and lots of people have that. But sometimes we just need to ask, because I have found that I'm like, oh, you guys have so much knowledge I can learn from. That's super helpful. So, and then one other thing I noticed in the chat, I know we can't address any of it, but I think it was Emily that made a comment, and just another kind of things to do not say that I thought was really good about just saying, oh, he'll grow out of it. Just give him time. It's just a phase. Yeah, I think that goes back to what Wendy was talking about, and I'm going to add that to my list because it's that sense of urgency that we have. So if we think about when we're doing really good screening, and if once we've provided some really good instruction, we should have a sense of urgency when kids aren't picking up on those skills. And so when we say things like that, oh, he's just going to grow out of it, that sometimes just diminishes everyone's level of concern. And so I would definitely agree with that. I think we need to respond to any of those things we see with good instruction, and be concerned if we've done a lot of teaching and a lot of explicit teaching, and we've done a lot and kids aren't picking it up. That should concern us.
And there's two other things in the chat I noticed. So Lisa, you asked a question about a student with an intellectual disability. So what's intriguing is one of the reasons that about 8 years ago that a lot of places backed off on having to have an IQ test. In the past, a lot of times a kid had to have an IQ in the average range to get a dyslexia diagnosis. Well, when we started looking at the research and finding out that IQ really wasn't predictive of whether kids could learn to read or not, and we realized that dyslexia can occur across intellectual abilities, and so they've actually done a lot of work now, and that you can use these type of programs with kids. It's just that their ability to generalize and the number of practices and the way you have to make it more concrete, you may have to modify those things, but that they can benefit from an explicit systematic type approach. Where some of the research is if kids don't have symbolic representation, right, because we are a alphabetic phonemic morphological system. If they don't have systematic, you may have to have more picture supports. But it's very interesting is that that we approach maybe that we have to build in more chances for transfer generalization, many more practices, but the fact they have an intellectual disability does not preclude them from a systematic explicit approach. But I will tell you, the wheels, it's sort of like turning a large ship, that some folks have still very definite opinions about that, but it is very intriguing in the last 8 to 10 years that the research is not really backing that up.
So Wendy, are you saying that like, could the parent specifically ask for explicit instruction and structured literacy for their child, or is it really based up to the school to determine what the child gets?
So this is such a very fun question. So reality is that we want the fact that our schools are offering evidence-based things, and parents can ask about what they're offering, where the evidence-based and things like that. Methodology it specifically has still been somewhat left in the hands of the districts in terms of that local control type of thing. Kristen, do you want to help kind of respond to this? Because I'm trying to be very thoughtful about this response.
Yeah,
parents can ask, and they should ask and ask good questions.
Parents can and should ask for whatever they think is appropriate, but the courts have left it clear that specific methodology, decisions on a curriculum, that all gets left to the local school district. And the local school and teacher parents don't get to dictate that. Now, I would add to that then that in Wendy's probably done the same thing. In my work with districts and with schools, I say we have to have some evidence behind what we're choosing and why. And so we would be wise to be very knowledgeable about making sure that we have a continuum of supports and that we know how to match the curriculum and the approaches that we're using to what students need. So parents can't come and say, I want this particular program by this person. But if parents are asking for evidence-based and we know their student has a particular need, we're going to need to make sure that what we choose and what we're providing is evidence-based. Otherwise, we don't really have a lot of justification to stand on when it comes to it. And at the same time, this is why we have requirements in there for progress monitoring, because at the end of the day, it's about whether the student is learning and making progress. If what we're doing seems crazy, but the student is making progress in all kinds of areas and ways that we do that, it's hard to argue with. But if we have parents asking for a change in instruction and we don't have data that says what we're currently doing is effective, that also just makes it a little bit more difficult for us to stand by what we're thinking.
And one other one I wanted to address real quick, the current endorsement for dyslexia requires 3 years of classroom experience. And so a lot of our SLPs don't have their classroom certification, so they aren't eligible currently for that particular, to apply to get that endorsement. Now, that doesn't mean that the same knowledge and the type of things that are being covered in there in professional learning in terms of understanding, then if you always go back to the International Dyslexia Association and the knowledge and practice standards, and that we can, people with field experience that are out there working in the schools, that we can provide that professional learning. So letters is one that a lot of folks use, but there's other ones that are out there now, and that's an avenue. But the endorsement currently is requiring that people have 3 years of classroom experience. So if you don't have your classroom certification, you're not currently eligible to earn that endorsement.
Stephanie, did you want to ask your question? I know you had your hand up earlier. Was it about college?
Yeah, well, my question was, in preparation for an introduction that I did, I came across some articles, and I think I'd sent some stuff out in some of the Facebook groups looking for what states have passed legislation, are considering legislation. And I came across an article that talked about 20 states have either passed or considering passing legislation requiring or regarding instruction being based on the science of reading. So, and it broke it down into charts, like what schools are, or excuse me, what states are going to require or are now going to require pre-service programs to be teaching the science of reading. What states are requiring pre-service teachers or teachers to pass exams for the science of reading and whatnot. And I'm not necessarily saying I agree that legislators should be dictating what we are doing in our classrooms and in our schools. But the flip side to that, even states who, from my very limited knowledge, even states who have like banned curriculum resources like the units of study or the Fontes Pinel guided reading, which I was a huge proponent. Let me tell you, my philosophy change has like been 360 big time. But even states that are banning those still have school districts that are using those things. So I'm just wondering, the Iowa Reading Research Center had an article about balanced and structured literacy, not recommending one or the other, but definitely, in my opinion, indicating that structured literacy was more effective for a higher percentage of students. Do you see any, because in the Heartland AEA, you're offering courses in the science of reading and structured literacy, which is awesome. How in Iowa do we get moving on this? Because unfortunately, what I heard, Kristen, you say that, parents shouldn't be able to, not parents shouldn't, sorry, but that these are things that technically schools are left to school decisions. But when we have schools that are so heavily immersed in balanced literacy and guided reading and teaching the 3 cueing system and not using a structured literacy approach, how do we move forward and getting more schools getting, like I'm a brand new college instructor, brand spanking new to science of reading. I've talked to the ed department, said, hey, these are some things that are going on in other states. This is the endorsement, the dyslexia endorsement. We know the Iowa or the International Dyslexia Association supports this. How do we keep moving forward? What are your recommendations? And
I think everyone in the room could probably generate an idea, maybe in the chat. What are ways that all of us, right? But I think the endorsement really helps, because after 2 years, right, the University of Iowa is offering it for 2 years, then those courses and those requirements will be released to other higher ed in the state of Iowa, so that more teachers, because right now they're limiting the cohort to 30 and 30, but that's part of what the plan is that they'll release that, so that, going back to get your endorsement to move on the pay scale is going to be one helpful thing. People that are interested, I think continuing to promote the professional learning that we're talking about here, asking for it, emailing are there any courses, and then Chris and I have influence, where we are too, and with our literacy consultants to keep promoting those kind of things. I know even as a state AAA system, we're trying to be more systematic in our supports and services and having these conversations. And I think that every which way we can, we need to promote and push the rock to get the change, right? And I'm still going to come back to, we have the tools, we have universal screening data, we look at interventions. If interventions are required, we have a tool now in student success that if interventions are in there, you can see the percentage of kids that they're successful for it. It's that urgency. What's our plan if they're not successful? Should we be looking at the type of instruction that we're currently providing to those kids if they're not moving, right? And start asking the question. And so I think it's all of those things. And then, like I said, I think everybody in this room, what are thoughts you guys have? And that's partly what this group is. How do we, as a grassroots movement, make the change?
Yeah, I agree. I think you articulated that really well, Stephanie, in terms of what the scope of the problem and where do you attack that from too, and where do you start? And I think it's, I can say we talked about that a lot in our task force groups, and it's not going to be a one size answer for all of it. And I think we also land on, and you kind of alluded to that too, like not having everything passed through the legislature is not always the best way to make movement either. So it's also thinking about, we are, as educators, are experts in this. And I think we underestimate kind of the power we have as a grassroots group to really demand that what we're following evidence-based practices and learning more. And I think we all have a part of that within the system. So it's that combination of all the different parts of that system continuing to kind of work towards that same goal of getting really good evidence-based instruction and literacy in all of our classrooms and teachers that understand that knowledge. And I don't know that there's going to be one way to do that and one right way to do that. It's going to take multiple efforts. So I just always appreciate anytime we have more people that are working towards that effort, and the more people that can understand that and are really passionate about that and are pushing towards that. So
I was wondering, if we can get to pre-service teachers, getting to the teachers before they've, not that we can't change, because we can, but, sorry, my dog's growling at me. We can, but I just think that it's so sad and scary how long, even think about myself personally, how long it's taken me to make this thought process change, and why, and I'm not sure why, but how can we continue to build this?
I think there's just power, Stephanie, in that learning. Once people get going, then they realize how different it is, but how full of joy it is to get the results.
What started you guys? Think about what got you guys on this journey, because are those avenues, whatever got you guys started, maybe those are avenues that we picked to get other people going, right? Colleagues, was it your district? What was it? Because I think it's going to take no matter which way we go at it, it takes a lot of people to move the rock, go in the same direction, right? So I think every avenue that we can is what we want to do. Knowledge is power.
So with the Reading League, there's a lot of like the Reading League Minnesota, the Reading League Wisconsin, the Reading League. Is that something that Iowa would, and I don't even know what that would entail, but because I know, it's so that it's not associated just for students with dyslexia, but this is for all students. Wendy, you're a mover and a shaker. Have you ever thought about looking at starting something like that, or Reading League Iowa that focused on the science of reading?
I have not, but you know what? See, there's another great idea. But you're right. That's another way to get a local organization attached to a national organization that brings knowledge and power, and another way into the state. I think all of those avenues are a great idea. That those are potential things in looking into it, because we just know this. We know our kids are worth it, and we need to do better. I think that every day that's what is sort of my vision and my thought and my goal, and what I was excited to get a chance to just hang out with you guys tonight is, how do we leverage and what are ways that we can connect with other national organizations and to make a difference. I think those are great ideas.
And I think as a school that's been steeped in structured literacy for 6 years now, we have had multiple other visitors from different districts. And I think one visit, or even from grandparents or somebody where they see kids, I had parents tell me at a restaurant, my first grader came home today and explained what a trigraph was to me and when to use it. And I think once other teachers, parents, grandparents, whoever see the power in the kids knowing the science, it just blows their socks off. And to us now, 6 years in, it seems part of our normal that even our struggling kindergarten, it's what we do. And it doesn't, in my mind, I think, how can everybody not be doing this? It's so much more fun. It's renewed the fun in teaching. And I want it so badly for other people to have it be that enjoyable. And we have had a lot of student teachers, they're just blown away. They said, I had no idea. And this is so cool. I am learning with the kids every single day. And, you just want people to feel that power and that joy when teaching's so hard. That's just one simple way of the day to lift some of that burden.
Yeah, and I think, some of the, Plain Talk and some of the national organizations are having administrators tell the story of how they started out in their district. And I think, getting some of those professional learning webinars to our administrators so that they know too, have maybe to start down this path. So I think it's all of those things, right? So districts that are there telling their story, telling about their success, the parents, grandparents, telling the stories. But I think even administrators sort of sharing at administrative conferences on how they started their school down that path, so other administrators can also do it. Because sometimes when the same part of a system talks to another part of a system, we get that synergy. So it's not all just coming from the teachers. And so I think those are other avenues that maybe your administrators could tell the story too, Liz.
I'm an instructional coach now. I've been a reading teacher. I've been a classroom teacher. But I think something I'm noticing that is starting urgency is parents are educating themselves and they're learning. And so some of the things that have really moved some of our learning has just been the urgency set before us with parents asking good questions. So I think that's awesome to see. I think that's come a long way over the years where we sit across the table from parents. There's sometimes where the parents they come with a lot of understanding. And so it's really up to the bar. I know in our district they're going to ask good questions and we have to be prepared for those good questions. So I think that's something promising I'm beginning to see. I don't know if all of you are, but there are those moments where we're seeing that from our families.
Well, thank you guys so much for coming and joining us tonight. We want to respect everybody's time, but you know how it's passionate work, so we could just talk about it all day, every day. I want to thank Kristen and Wendy for volunteering their time to help us. I know it was an easy yes for them to say, help us with some information and knowledge, because they know that you spend a lot of time outside of your school day researching on your own and helping kids along the way. So reach out if you have any extra questions for them and I can get it to them. Thanks for everyone for joining us tonight, and we'll see you in May. Yeah. Bye. Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone. Thanks.
What a great group, guys.
Thank
Next time I'm coming back just to be a lurker and just listen.
Yeah, thanks again, guys. That was amazing.